Welcome. This is the second lecture on mindfully facing climate change. And the main topic today is then the second noble truth, which points out that the root cause for dukkha is craving. So the task is to find a way to see our personal responsibility in relation to any dukkha, whether it is on the personal level or on the global level. And in order to approach this topic, I have chosen another discourse, the discourse on the world ruler, which describes a gradual environmental degradation that seems to fit quite well to what we're talking about now. And the discourse starts with a short passage that introduces the main theme of the discourse, which the body of the discourse then fleshes out in the form of what seems to be a parable. So let us look at the first passage. So the terminology here, an island to oneself, the term has different meanings, and it could also mean a lamp to oneself. But the basic idea is, the second term is very clear, a refuge. To find a refuge in oneself and to have the Dharma, the Buddhist teaching, as one's refuge. And the next passage shows how that comes about. This is, of course, the standard description of Satipatthana meditation. For spheres of such meditation: body, feeling, dawn, mind, dharmas, combination of mindfulness with clear knowing or clear comprehension, sampajanya, and diligence, atapi, standing representative for energy, making an effort. And then the overall purpose of mindfulness practice to lead to freedom from greedy desire and sadness. Now, the use of this relationship of mindfulness practice to the idea of taking refuge in oneself in the suttas usually comes in situations related to grief. In particular, when somebody very dear is about to pass away or has passed away. And in the present passage, however, we get the same relationship between Satipatthana, the establishments of mindfulness, and being a refuge to oneself, taking refuge in the Dharma, in relation to environmental degradation. So the key point, before even we get into the actual discourse, to be taken is that from an early Buddhist viewpoint, mindfulness is the chief quality to face climate change and environmental destruction. To learn to face it without looking away and without succumbing to grief. Now, the discourse on the world ruler, after giving this initial theme, be a refuge to yourself through mindfulness, sets into this prolonged, I think it's a parable, into this prolonged parable, which begins by describing kings in ancient times who ruled righteously, passed on the rulership from one to the next, until eventually a king came into power who did not follow the example of earlier kings. He did not adopt the type of rulership that had been established, but ruled according to his own ideas. Let us look at the passage which describes what happened after that. So because the king failed to look after those in need, poverty became spread. And as a result of poverty, of course, somebody started to steal. Let us look at the next passage. So I think the passage very clearly puts the spotlight for the occurrence of theft on the failure of the government to properly look after the needs of people. And this, in the ancient Indian setting, is quite a remarkable position, which resonates very much with our modern kind of thinking. Let us see how the story continues. So the king here clearly acts out of compassion. So we see he's not really like a thoroughly bad person. He's just been negligent earlier, and now he feels sorry for this person, says, here, take some of my wealth, and you can look after yourself. However, this has unintended consequences. So you see, this was compassion, all right, but it was misguided compassion. It was compassion without wisdom. The king did not realize that this gesture of, oh, the poor man, let me give him something so he doesn't have to steal, that he was actually rewarding immoral behavior. And that rewarding immoral behavior by the authorities will simply lead to increasing that very immoral behavior. And as theft continues to spread, of course, they arrest others and again bring them in front of the king. So now the king realizes that this doesn't work, that if he gives wealth to those who steal, then it will become more and more. And so he decides to change his policy. So the passage in the version that I'm quoting here is not entirely clear, but we can get the connection from one of the parallels where it was actually the owner of the goods that had been stolen who caught the thief and brought him to the king. And then it makes, of course, sense. Like if I steal and I know I'm going to get punished, then if I kill the owner, the chances that I'm being brought in front of the king are much less. And so we see how there is a gradual increase or acceleration of immorality. From theft, it leads to killing. And then when somebody is caught and brought in front of the king asks, did you really steal? Then that person, knowing that he's going to get punished, says, no, I didn't do it. So we have also falsehood, the speaking of lies. And so there's a gradual increase of immoral behavior described here. Let us look at the next passage. So this describes just an acceleration, a gradual increase of immoral behavior that eventually results in the shortening of people's lifespan. But the repercussions of this increase of immorality also extends to the environment. The passage here is relatively short. We get more detailed description of environmental destruction in some of the parallels. But even this much already tells us, ghee and butter is no longer available. It means there are no more dairy products, no more honey. The bees are no more, probably become extinct, something that we fear already now. Sesame and sugarcane to produce molasses are no longer there. Even salt is no longer available, which presumably could be a breakdown of traffic in salt. And instead of rice, which is a water intensive crop, we have kodo millet. As you can see in the image, this is a small perennial grass that is usually grown wild. And the kodo millet can survive very well even on marginal soils. It requires very little water in order to grow. And for this reason, it has very good drought tolerance. It doesn't need an irrigation system comparable to rice. And it also survives on very low nutrient soil. And the seeds are considered an inferior food in India. So what we find here is a gradual deterioration in moral conduct that expresses itself also in a deterioration of the environment. And this relationship drawn here is something I will come back soon, but I want to first continue with this discourse, what it describes on how this immorality reaches a peak point. So the discourse describes a behavior among family members, which needs to keep in mind that in ancient India, the family was a very, very important unit and family bonds were of high importance. So here, family members kill each other. They feel hatred for each other, just similar to a hunter who is stalking an animal. So, in the ancient Indian context, this is a depiction of a total breakdown of ethics. However, not everybody participates in that. So, these others, these few who escape, who do not kill and hide so that they are not killed, they will then be the continuity of human civilization in this depiction. And after this a mass slaughtering of all the others is come to an end, then these refugees, we might even call them, they meet with each other and they are so glad to have survived. But they also cry with each other for all their relatives and friends they have lost. And then they decide, look, all these horrible developments have come about because of a lack of ethics. We have to change our behavior. Let us all agree, first of all, having seen how horrible all this killing was, we will not kill. So these human beings that have survived adopt the first precept in early Buddhism, not killing living beings. And from not killing living beings, their lifespan increases naturally. And so, as they see the positive effect of moral conduct, they keep on taking more and more commitments, no stealing, no falsehood, etc. And so, from an all time low point of complete breakdown of morality and ethics, complete deterioration of the environmental situation, The discourse continues and gradually leading up to a peak point again of prosperity, nature recovers, and high ethical conduct among human beings. At this point in the Pali version, the future Buddha Maitreya comes in, but we know from study of the parallels that this is probably a later edition, and it has no real bearing on the main story. The main story is really to show the importance of ethics, even in relation to environmental degradation. And this idea in early Buddhist thought that unwholesome conduct has repercussions even on the ecological level is also found in another passage. Let us look at that. So, what this passage tells us is basically that unrighteousness of the rulers gradually penetrates down to the whole populace. And I've left out a few intermittent steps here which may not be so immediately understandable from our modern perspective, and just left out those pieces that left in those pieces that are more easily appreciated. But basically, the belief is that this unrighteousness then leads to the winds being irregular, sufficient rain does not fall, the crops ripen irregularly, and people become short-lived. So this all resonates quite well with what we know about climate change. There is indubitably a lack of ethical concern leading to the current situation. It does lead to irregular wind. It has already and increasingly will lead to a lack of proper rain, diminishing of crops, and that will certainly diminish people's lifespan. So we have here, even though expressed in the ancient Indian thought world and idiom, we have here a description that can be very well adapted to the present situation. And whatever we may think about the details, the basic message stands. It's a matter of ethics. And this, I think, is really the key teaching that early Buddhism can give here, pointing the finger at ethics. And pointing the finger at ethics in early Buddhism is pointing the finger at ethics of the mind. That is crucial. Let us look at the passage. This just summarizes that unwholesome type of conduct can have a bodily and a verbal dimension, or it can be related to livelihood. But then it continues. So this really points us directly at what in early Buddhist thought are considered the three root poisons: lust or greed, hatred or anger, and delusion. This is where all unwholesome conduct originates, and this is where in the long run also environmental destruction originates. And I think in my attempt to do justice to early Buddhist thought and provide an early Buddhist perspective on the current dilemma, this shift of perspective towards mental states is of crucial importance. My proposal is to view the entire situation less in terms of individuals, and more in terms of mental states. To see to frame the whole issue in terms of having to counter greed, anger, and delusion. In the recognition that to some extent these are within ourselves. Of course, others are much stronger under the influence of these, they act them out quite strongly. But to have this perspective of a shared problem that needs addressing. And I must say, I personally find it very helpful to look at certain events that have been taken place recently where a particular individual is responsible for something that is responsible for something that is highly irresponsible, to put it mildly. To not take this particular person, name and picture and focus, but to just see that, wow, this is what defilements can do. And to see those who actively contribute to the destruction of the environment and to the shortening of lifespan for the whole of human civilization, to see them as icons of unwholesome mental states. And for me, it is an important shift in perspective and really helps me to approach the situation with the kind of inner balance required for proper action. And to approach the whole situation from the viewpoint of the three root poisons is, of course, to start first of all with ourselves. Just with the earth element, we first explored the earth element in this body and then the external one. So it is also with the three root poisons. And I would like us to look now at the relevant mindfulness practice. So what mindfulness does here is monitoring. Mindfulness is a feminine quality. She monitors and gives us this information. Is there greed? Is there no greed? Is there anger? Is there no anger? Is there delusion? Is there no delusion? And I would like to point out that this refers not only to our own internal mental states, but also to external mental states, which I understand to mean the mental states of others. This can be seen in the next passage. So the passage starts with contemplating internally, which I understand to mean our own mind. Then it moves on to contemplating externally, the minds of others. And eventually it sees both. In a way, the distinction between ourselves and others becomes less important, recedes to the background, and it's just a question of these mental states. So what I would like to do now, as a way of implementing this internal personal perspective, is to match the three root poisons: greed, hatred or anger, and delusion, with three types of reaction to the environmental crisis. This is just my personal matching, so it's no canonical authority behind that. The first match is that I would propose is to match denial with greed. Denial in the sense of pretending that climate change is not really happening, it's not caused by human beings, and particularly not looking at its repercussions, and perhaps most painfully also not seeing the dimension of what we call climate justice, that those countries who are most responsible are not the first ones to get the results, but the results strike most strongly in poor countries, underdeveloped countries. And climate change denial has even become a sponsored activity. There are interest groups who actively spread misinformation in order to prevent that action is taken because they fear that such action would cut their profits and interests. But climate change denial can also very easily happen on the personal level. We just want to continue living the life we have. We don't want to face what's taking place. Just continue flying, eating the kind of foods we like, enjoying the comforts of our daily life. And I think it is important to just be aware of that, to see that this is not a question of turning our carbon footprint into some sort of original sin, and now we have to atone for that by being hard on ourselves, but to see that taking responsibility for the situation requires some adjustments in our lifestyle to separate wants from needs. And all of this can take place under the overarching concern of diminishing greed. And the second match, which is kind of terminologically quite obvious, anger and hatred. The realization that some leading politicians and other influential people are actively preventing the required change from happening can easily give rise to anger. But from an early Buddhist perspective, and this is something I will come back to in the next lecture, there's no place even for righteous anger. Anger isn't defilement of the mind. Anger may give us the impression that we see things very clear because of its thrust. It gives a sense of sharpness, putting things into relief, but at the cost of distortion, but at the cost of distorting the proportions and narrowing down to ignore the context. Anger can never give us an appropriate view of the situation. Therefore, it is impossible for anger to lead to appropriate reaction. It is crucially important to stick with equanimity. And if anger arises, to deal with that on the internal level until it's resolved and then take action externally. And the last one is resignation, which I would match to delusion. Resignation in the sense that, what can I do? This is such a huge problem. There's so many people. Government should take care of it. I'm just one. And I like to call this delusion. Of course, greed and anger are also forms of delusion. But when I use delusion here, I mean more narrowly understood as a form of delusion that is not obviously related to greed and not obviously related to anger. And it is a misunderstanding of the degree of our responsibility. Our responsibility is to embody our own convictions, to act coherently, independent of the results. I do what I think right, not because such and such that thing must happen, but because I know it's right. And when I do that, the action I take stands on its own. And in brackets, we might say, if everybody would be doing that, the world will change. But the question is not what can one individual do to change the world, but all individuals can change the world. And this is what's happening right now. If we see the climate change is probably the gravest problem ever faced in the history of human civilization. It could lead to the end of humanity. But right now we also see the most widespread grassroots movement ever seen in the history of humanity, and without a central organization. So there is hope. There is a potential for this whole situation to lead to a complete shift in global awareness, to lead to a better world. But that requires that each of us participate in that. We are the generation during which time this has happened, and the generation that will set the course for the future. Therefore, to go for resignation and ignore our responsibility, I consider that a form of delusion. The actual meditation practice then takes up the mindful contemplation of the mind, of these three, the presence of these three. And it builds on the practice I described in the last lecture, the contemplation of earth. Perhaps the chief difference is really what contemplation of the mind in early Buddhism is about. It is about this tendency that we normally have to always look at what is outward, what is happening there, and to turn in, to look at the mind, what's happening in the mind. To have this monitoring of mindfulness as if she's sitting on over our shoulder, watching what's happening inside and outside. And so in order to encourage this monitoring dimension of mindfulness, my suggestion is that right at the beginning, when we sit down and come to whole body awareness, immediately to establish this monitoring. Just as now you can listen to what I say, or you can listen and know that you're listening. Just play a moment with this too. Just listen, or listen and know that you're listening. There's a slight difference there, and that difference is exactly what I'm talking about. That monitoring ability of mindfulness, that knowing what we are doing. And this monitoring can accompany us to the body scan, the breathing. And then, sooner or later, of course, the mind is going to get distracted. Very important not to get upset. It happens to all of us. After so many years of practice, I still get distracted. The mind running off and going, oh my God, Anālayo, where did you go? I never wanted to go there. So be kind to yourself. Smile when the mind gets distracted. That's just what the mind does. And could it happen? Now I can do contemplation of the mind. Let me see. That distraction, fantasy, daydream, what feeling tone? Affective, quality, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Noticing the feeling tone then gives us a first pointer. If it was pleasant, quite probably some greed involved there. If it was unpleasant, chances are anger, irritation. And if it was neutral, then delusion. Again, of course, the other two are also delusion, but I have the more narrow idea of delusion. When the mind is just ambling around for no purposes, popping here, hopping there, blop, blop, and bringing it back to the present moment. And bringing it back to the present moment again. Notice the quality of the mind when mindfulness is there. If you look very closely, there's a very subtle, pleasant feeling. Very subtle. The subtle, pleasant feeling of being in the present moment. Noticing that can be a great boost to our meditation practice. The presence of mindfulness and that subtle, pleasant feeling. I think that is about what I have for this second lecture. So just to sum up again, we were looking at the second noble truth, finding that the environmental destruction has its roots in immoral behavior, that immoral behavior has its roots in states of mind, the three root poisons, and the task is to cultivate mindfulness, to recognize these three root poisons inside and outside. Thank you for your attention.